Welcome to everyone. We continue with our exploration. What was the place of women within early Christianity following the research of Caroline Osiek and Margaret MacDonald with Jeanette Tulloch in a book in which the picture represents women. This is a picture taken from the catacombs. Women sharing the table, the meal with men, which was something which speaks about how the Roman culture challenged, in a sense, the boundaries of women in traditional Jewish societies and even Greek societies, and how that is to account for the relevance of women within early Christianity. So the thesis of the book is not so much that early Christianity changed the role of women within society and therefore also in the church, but sort of the contrary. That stands a little bit apart from the influence of the founder, Jesus himself, that is depicted in the gospel in a very, you can say, almost countercultural terms in relationship of his women disciples. The chapter that we are going to take upon is women patrons in house churches. And here is a quote: "The role of women patrons in the life of the early church is a subject that has received little attention, yet it is central to the understanding of women in house churches in earliest years." And we know that it has received little attention because history is written on what happens in public spaces. And public spaces are occupied by men who often in the public space contend for a place of prominence that is often equivalent to the honorable status of a person in the eyes of the others. Not so for women. The place of women is within the perimeter of the household. And there is no history that accounts for what happens inside the many houses. However, we know one important data, that is inside the house where the church eventually developed, women had prominence, and therefore the impact of women on the development of early Christianity is the most significant, yet the least accounted for story. And the chapter starts with an emphasis on the concept of patronage in the world of early Roman Empire. What is patronage? Patronage is the relation between patron and client. Therefore, is a relationship that is based on vertical, superior, inferior, unequal, and mutually compromising through voluntary and not legally enforced. I'm going to say something that may come to a shock, but it's actually a political structure that is still very much present within Mediterranean society. In Italy, for instance, what we now recognize as mafia is a system of patronage that became criminal in the moment in which an idea of democracy based on the equal status of citizens and the equal participation of all the members of society in the caring for the common group of the nation, basically eliminated or wanted to sideline something that was there for hundreds and hundreds of years and that functioned. And therefore, once pushed to the boundaries, it became a secretive criminal organization where il padrino in the system of patronage is the one that provides benefits to the others. The patron in that type of structure, it's really someone who cares for the needs of the people, who has more, and from the wealth accumulated, people depend upon. In other countries, this is still very much a system. Wherever we say that in order to progress, you need a friend that opens a door for you, that is exactly the structure of patronage, which is vertical. So the idea of equality is countercultural. Who wants equality? If by equality you lose the help of your own benefactor. Now, again, we in the Western world have a sort of abandoned that in many ways, but in more circumscribed spaces is still like that. Whenever the relationship is unequal, whether, for instance, a teacher and a student, the students will often, for instance, be very treat the teacher with great honor, especially in public spaces, and in the hope of receiving maybe a benefit. Okay, so wherever there is an unequal, mutually compromising relationship, that is sort of what patronage stands. So the client, in exchange of the benefit, would give proper praise to the patron in front of other people, giving him honor. And honor was really the element, the key that would open the doors within a social relationship. That's why we say you need a powerful friend. Who is that powerful friend if not someone who is recognized by the community as someone with honor, with power? Now, there is an interesting use of patron benefactor in a quote from the letter of Paul to the Romans 16:1-2 that says, "Now I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church in Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and provide her with whatever help she may need from you, for she has been a patron." The Greek word is prostates, which is a combined word, a prepositional verb with pro and istemi, standing for, being there for the benefit of others. For she has been a patron to many, including me. So you can see here something that is very relevant, because the patronage is not just something attributed to men, but is attributed to a woman, Phoebe. Now, while the Latin language of patronage contains such direct words as patronatus, patron as a client, okay, by the time of the early empire, this language was generally considered too abrasive to the delicate honor system, and a new set of terms was adopted into the structures of patronage, which is that of friendship. Let me just, meaning that often let me just, here there are some things that are not supposed to be like that. Okay, and client. Meaning that often the understanding of friendship, for those who have taken a class on friendship in the New Testament with me, we spoke about this. Friendship is not what we would understand now. Friendship was when there was a mutual common interest that would tie two people. And again, if we think how many times we have called a friend who is not in the same category of an intimate friend, we would say that is more like friendly, maybe. And what is that qualification of friendliness, if not that somehow there is an element of mutual interest, mutual benefit. You give some and you receive some, and that creates a sense of friendship. You can even consider that element of friendship within the market exchange, where someone who wants to sell you something approaches you with great friendliness. Is that your friend? No. And yet that word friendship or friendliness basically incorporates a mutual system of interest. Now, patronage had also a special impact on the relation between slave owner, a patron, and freed slave, libertus, in a Roman Empire, Roman society, where the obligation of honor and respect was much stronger on the part of the freed slave towards his owner. Secondly, the case of euergetism, or public patronage. What is euergetism? Comes from two, again, words. One is a preposition eu, which means good, and argo, which means like, to do something good, meaning you are a public benefactor. You are going to say what happens today when billionaires donate a lot of money, maybe to help homeless or to do something for the common benefit of society. That is also an element of patronage that was present within the early Roman Empire. And it was often, rewarded with thankful inscriptions, or had a statue erected in his or her honor, and was seated in a place of honor at official gatherings of the group, was appointed to an official position, which may be honorary, and was generally hailed as a very important person. Of course, the role of the emperor constituted the highest form of public patronage. The emperor would be like, the father of the people. As a matter of fact, that the word patria, referred to the nation, is associated with the fact of being a father, a pater to the nation. And that all comes from the early Roman Empire. Now, the book makes a research about what was the state of patronage on the part of women within the Roman world. And if you will read in this PowerPoint, which basically takes the whole chapter, you will find a list of women who owned businesses and were active in politics. Very difficult to see something like that within Jewish and even Greek societies of antiquity. And, among the several examples that you find over here, and you will see later on even inscriptions and statues dedicated to them, you find the wife of Augustus, very famous in antiquity, one of the most famous women that goes by the name of Livia, who was nominated Mater of the Patria, which is sort of an oxymoron, because it is really matter of if we call it the nation Patria, she would have been the Matria. So you would have called with a female terminology something that is recognized as a male reality. Now, in the Roman imperial world, women could share the table at meals and therefore being able to influence and opinionate on issues with male counterparts. Now, notice that this is sort of inferred from some of the readings. It wasn't for sure a universal reality. However, there are abundant testimonies, especially among elite women who had a social and financial status, that this was the case. And as we see in sociological studies, evolution is always speared by a minority that normalizes something that for the majority is still considered unacceptable. It was unacceptable for women to associate in the same space of men in public gatherings, and yet that was speared by a group of women who were more prominent within the empire, and that would claim a status that opened the door. Think, for instance, how we speak about our vice president Kamala Harris, and that for reference to the glass ceiling, and how by breaking it through her presence, a new set of opportunities are there for all other women. This was the case also within a sociological dynamic of early Christianity. However, women's patronage was not limited to the elite. The evidence from Pompeii, that city that was frozen, calcified, better said, in time because of the eruption of the Vesuvio, the volcano, that basically covered the town of Herculanus and Pompeii in ashes that killed the people and then solidified them into a cover of rock, really, that was uncovered just a little bit more than a century ago, and that still unearths new things. For instance, just 1 or 2 weeks ago in the newspaper, there was the image of a man or of 2 men still with their clothes and their mantles laying on the ground, the whole body being preserved, even with the little dog on their side, as they were trying to escape, and because of the gases, they died. If you have a chance to see, there is a movie called Pompeii, a Hollywood movie, but still it traces back, the phenomenon of what happened over there, and they speak of a scientist of the time, Pliny, which we have often, Pliny the Elder, which we have often encountered even in our own studies. So it says that evidence from Pompeii reveals women active in a variety of businesses and trades. And they rented out and leased buildings and sold various commodities. Okay. Now, when it comes to patronage of groups, women's patronage of unofficial groups is an activity that bears directly on our understanding of the patronage in early Christianity, meaning when it is a woman, for instance, that hosts a group of early Christians into her house. She is the patron for that community of people. But it was also the case of women sponsoring beneficial donations on behalf of groups of different kinds. That was, again, common within the Roman Empire, the early empire. When we talk about the early empire, Augustus, we find that there is a synchronicity, because when Augustus, the Son of God, the Divus Augustus, was born and created the empire, that is exactly the time that coincides with the birth of Jesus and early Christianity. The gospel, the word gospel, was the announcement that was given throughout the empire for the birth or for the nomination by acclamation of the new emperor. So they would go and say, here I have a good news. We have, a new emperor, similar to when the Pope is, chosen. And you have white smoke coming out, and he says, we have the Pope. The announcement he's making is a joyous announcement. Gospel means good news. Okay, we've gone from good news to fake news, but the gospel is still about the news. Okay. Now, for instance, we again find a long list of people that witnessed to this patronage of women that were, you shouldn't really say patron, you should say matrons, that would benefit groups and people. For instance, one is Eumachia, was a public priestess of the imperial cult in Pompeii, and the matron of the Fuller's Guild. Guild is like a union of all the people that work with metal, often to do the shoes of the horses. And she would be in charge of creating worship before the statue of the emperor, because the statue of the emperor would be the sign of unity for all the members of the empire, and therefore by showing reverence and honoring that statue, declare publicly that you were not against the empire, that you were a loyal member of the community, something that we know Jewish people and early Christian refused, because they thought that would be idolatry. So she made a donation of public construction to promote piety and harmony, like billionaires do today in many different fields. And her statue, with many inscriptions, are still preserved today. What do we do today with these famous people? Well, maybe we call a street and nominate a square or a building, with their name. Or we give them the opportunity to build a library, the presidential library, where their name is going to be recorded in history. Another one is Junia Theodora, who built an anchor hold in Corinth. Corinth is a seaport, and so she created a place where people could anchor their boat, and gave hospitality in her house for travelers. And because of the use of the word prostasia, patronal leadership for her activity, she is an important comparative figure for the work of Phoebe, which we just found, Prostatis, in Romans 16:1-2. She was really, it is translated as a patron, but it would be really as a matron, because Prostatis really says standing in favor, being in favor, okay? And so now in Herculaneum, close to Pompeii, where the hardened mud that covered the city made immediate retrieval of precious items much more difficult than at Pompeii, more statuary was preserved than at Pompeii. So in Herculaneum, which is very close, is a neighboring town to Pompeii, 40% of the of statues were dedicated to women, mostly large and in bronze and metal. That means something. If 40% of the statues were to honor the patronage of some women, they were set up alongside those of men. Therefore, there was not a group for men and a group for women, but they were mixed together. In the theater and in the forum would be the place where people would gather together, where trials were conducted. And there was, as I said, no perceptible gender pattern to say here men and there women. They were all mixed together. We are accustomed to think systematically about women in this society in terms of gender dichotomies in a gender-based hierarchical structure. But in face of the evidence, we can only conclude that women of self-sufficient social status in the Roman world exercised a great deal of freedom and power with regard to business and social activities. So we cannot say women of antiquity, let's say, were all oppressed. Of course, especially comparing to modern standard, but even, if we look, there were varieties of nuances. Now, what made possible for some women to sort of elevate, to be that spearhead that eventually challenged and changed the role that was assigned to them in a patriarchal society? Riet van Bremen, in the essay Women and Wealth, notes that traditional ideas and laws about the subjection and confinement of women seem to have changed little. So culturally, they were still in the same place. What made the change possible is the concentration of wealth in the hands of some women, is the economy that makes the difference. When we talk today about equal pay between men and women, we are very much going along what we did over here. Financial status of women promoted and changed their role. And, protected them from the controls that was placed against them by social, status quo. Another factor is that in the Roman social system, different from the older Greek ways, status took precedence over gender, meaning that, the most important element was not whether you were a man or a woman, but it was more like, how much money do you have? What is your condition, in society? So a person of higher social status, a person of higher social status and access to power could function as mediator and dispenser of favor, regardless of sex, with the same expectations of reciprocity in terms of honor, praise, and loyalty on the parts of the clients. So you could have the case of women, affluent women, financially speaking, who would be in a condition to be matron and have both men and women give them back honor, praise, and loyalty. Now, when we move to the Christian role in this cultural dimension, let me just we find these elements. Patronage underlies exchanges of hospitality, the hosting of Christian gatherings, and most relationships of persons to other persons and to groups. So let us recall the kinds of things clients could expect of patrons, realizing that the same relationship were present in the Christian communities. So if you were a client, you would receive maybe material and cash gifts, food and dinner invitation. The invitation to dinner were symbolic representations of what was your status. So the one who would sit closer to the patron would be in a higher standing compared to someone that would be sitting like farther away. They would receive lodging, favorable recommendations and appointments, help in matchmaking, and bequests and inheritances. So these characteristics, of course, had to apply also to the patron and matrons of the early Christian community, mostly the matrons, because they are the one that would be sort of in charge of the early Christian community. Unfortunately, these acts of benefaction passed unnoticed. Okay, this is the important thing. Unnoticed because of the public restrictions forced upon Christians up to the 3rd century, meaning that what happened within the household in the relationship of patronage was never visible to anyone because Christians would not make public claim and invitation. It would be more secretive, the way in which they would gather. So here a question. How did the figures of Jesus and Paul affect the honor-shame social relations inside the community? How did the death of Jesus and the preaching of the cross, which is not for sure like, a very honorable statement, in the letter of Corinthians and Galatians alter the perception of patronage? Network theory tells us that it's not ideas, but personal contacts that create the environment for joining, for continued allegiance, and therefore for conversions. Meaning that, as it was in the past, you at the end change because a friend invites you, tells you, so on and so forth. So these social networks were active also within Christian community. And the question, therefore, is how did those social networks operate among the non-elites of the Roman cities who were brought into contact with Christian evangelizers? Famous is the accusation that Celsius made against the Christians, saying that the strategy of the Christian missionaries was exactly to create a network within women and at the lower level of society, because they were ignorant and they were easy to be convinced compared to the men and to the higher, more educated people. The proclamation of the reign of God is the announcement of efficient patronage. Why? Well, take for instance the statement, knock and it will be given to you, ask and you will receive what you ask for. That is exactly what a system of patronage does. We steal often have shaped a relationship with God as a patronage relationship. We go and we pray as inferior, as client to God and say, please God, heal my daughter. Please God, make me win the lottery. Please God, help me to travel safely. Please God, help me not to be sick. And then we receive it and we feel like, I'm going to light a candle. Thank you. We're going to do like, and if instead, we ask for something, we don't receive what we say, we get mad with God. Why? Because in the system of patronage, that's exactly what is expected. We have done our part by begging. You have not done your part by giving. You see how it works. The relationship is certainly asymmetrical, but reciprocal. Loyalty and praise are expected of clients in return for favors granted. If the favors are not granted, there is no loyalty, there is no praise. And Jesus is God's authorized agent on earth. Of course, this is like, a cultural description within the cultural language of patronage. Dispensing such favors as healing, exorcisings, and above all, forgiveness of sin and the release of debt. So the disciples are empowered at various levels to carry on the same work of dispensing God's patronage. There is, however, an abundance of talk about charis. Charis is grace, okay, theologically. But in the world in which Paul developed this new meaning, the semantic field of charis, the semantic field of charis is that of favor, graciousness, benefaction, okay? Benefaction is the word that we want to underline, and therefore of the asymmetrical relationship of patronage. So we say that we are saved by grace. No, we are saved by benefaction of our patron, of whom we are clients. Okay. The refusal of Paul to be paid for his ministry, he was a tent maker, was explicitly said so that he would not establish patron-client relationship. Why? Because Paul wanted to be the patron, not the client. He didn't want to be bound by the duty of, being inferior towards those who gave. He wanted to be the boss. And so he didn't receive any gift. Remember that gifts were often used almost as a menace, as a threat. From an anthropological point of view, if you give too much to a person who cannot reciprocate in equal standing, you put the other person in a condition of danger, of not being reciprocal and mutual, creating a sense of, deeper awareness of inferiority. So Paul has set up his own patronage system in which their gratitude to him will cultivate loyalty, not the other way around. Stephanus, particularly, can be singled out for his social prominence, for he hosts Paul and the whole church, the members of which are expected as good clients to be submissive to him. Here is the quote. Now, brothers and sisters, you know about the household of Stephanus, that as the first convert of Achaia, they devoted themselves to ministry for the saints. I urge you also to submit, notice the word, to people like this, and to everyone who cooperates in the work and labors hard. Now, we have seen women extending benefaction to individual leaders and groups. For instance, we have seen the mother of John Mark in Jerusalem when Peter is freed from the jail and goes straight to the house of this lady, or Nympha in the Colossians, Lydia in the Acts of the Apostle, and Prisca in several texts, the wife of Aquila in the Acts of the Apostles, in the letter to the Corinthians, in the letter to the Romans. Now, when Paul and Barnabas in Antioch of Pisidia, modern Turkey, not Antioch of Syria, are preaching in the synagogue, they experience rejections not only by men, but also by prominent women. But the Jews incited the God-fearing women of high social standing and prominent men of the city, stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas and threw them out of the region. The same apostles have a different reception in Thessalonica. Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large group of God-fearing Greeks and quite few prominent women. Who are these prominent women in this patronage structure? This is an important message that we also find, and that was the one that you already read at the beginning of Phoebe, who is called both diakonos and prostatis. Okay, these were two important words that would refer to this issue of patronage. Taking account of everything we have already seen, it becomes clear that the connotations are not so much presider, meaning that if women were in the patron, they would be the equivalent of, let's say, the presider in a liturgical assembly, though that is not to be ruled out, because they were standing in a privileged place. But the patronal benefaction, and therefore the prestige and authority that come from that position. While it is true that neither the masculine prostates nor the feminine prostatis necessarily includes hospitality, this role cannot be ruled out either. Okay. So, this is a quote. While real legal and ideological differences remained, it is doubtful whether in the everyday practice of patronal relationships, much difference could have been perceived between the practice of patronage among men and women, except for voting and holding elective office, and even there other aspects of the political process are very similar. Likewise, in early Christianity, there was a little difference between the patronage of men and women, but the patronage function was an essential ingredient in the life of the house churches. Ultimately, the patronal power began to be absorbed into the hands of the bishop. But in that case, both women and non-clerical men found that it was a different world. This is what we find in this quote, which basically says that just make sure that which basically says that we recall the history of Christianity from the moment in which it became a public institution. Much less is accounted for when it was a private household reality in which women had a more prominent role compared to the one of men, whose space of action and recognition was the public arena, not the private one. And when eventually the church became a public, it adopted the social conventions structure of the reality of the early empire, which was patriarchal and hierarchical, very much different from, for instance, the experience of Jesus in the early Christian movement, that began as a fringe minority who did not intend to create an institution, but to create a new type of community relationship, even for women, that Jesus, an early Christian, came to call the kingdom of God. And this brings to a conclusion our class. Just I want to highlight that there are, some interesting pictures that you can enlarge in this one, and they speak of, for instance, in this case, the recreation of space that Julia Felix donated for the well-being of people, where they could dine, swim, and walk in the gardens. And here you find a statue of Eumachia, a patron in Pompeii, for the fuller's guile. And you find here Plancia Magna, patron of Perga, again a woman whose status was honored. And you find here a dedicatory inscription on a tomb, a burial tomb that is still, preserved today. I invite you all to read, the conclusion, which sort of summarize a little bit many of the elements of what we have done during the classes.